Hello, I'm Rob Price. This season, we're exploring Agentic AI from the perspectives of those driving its evolution. Welcome to Futurize.
Hi, I'm Nell Watson. I am a researcher in AI ethics and safety. I do a lot of work in standardization and certifications, and I'm co-author of Safer Agentic AI, Principles and Responsible Practices with my co-author, Ali Hassami.
Nell, it's great to have you on the podcast. I'm delighted that you've been able to join us in the new year for kind of a bit of a special, but perfect timing as well, because the book's only just out, isn't it?
It is indeed. I'm very excited because it distills a lot of the knowledge about agentic AI that I and my team, a working group of about 25 people, have managed to compile. And we did this in advance of agentic really becoming a thing. We started off about 3 or 4 years ago when it was kind of a rumbling on the horizon. And since then, of course, it has really hit the market in a big way. Lots of people are waking up to the possibilities, especially in the last month or so, December 2025 onward. We've seen the adoption of Claude Code by a lot of people, and it's the new model Opus 4.5, which is so powerful in agentic AI. And I think 2026 and beyond is going to be the time when people really start to embed this into our lives. But of course, these systems are capable of doing so many things we don't expect or didn't ask for, and that's why we need to do things in a safe and reliable manner.
I think it's really interesting the way that you kind of dated it back, because from our point of view, kind of we started building agents before they were really called agents. We called them AI team
Mm,
members as well. So this whole thing over the last year of agentic dominating everything on LinkedIn, really, in terms of much of that conversation, timing is perfect. But how would you define agentic AI in the context of the focus that you've had on the book? I've said a few times on the rest of the season that agentic feels a bit like cloud in the early days. No matter what
mm.
it is, I'm going to call it cloud. No matter what this is, I'm going to call it agentic AI. How would you define it?
Well, really, we've gotten used to the idea of using generative AI in the 2020s through crafting text or images, more recently audio and video and things like that. But that's still been kind of a backwards and forth, tit for tat discussion with the AI to try to create a thing. Whereas with agentic, we are trying to do a thing instead of make a thing. So an agentic AI system would be able to, for example, manage a bunch of infrastructure or to take action on a very complex software or literature project, for example. And increasingly as well, these systems are able to act in an autonomous way. So they're not necessarily waiting for us to give them instructions or to you know, give them the next step. They can actually be given a mission and they can figure out how to fulfill that mission over maybe 100 steps. And they can now do this increasingly reliably. And that means that we can hand off to these systems and let them run at arm's length, which is, of course, immensely liberating. I mean, I use it myself for designing scientific and engineering experiments in Claude Code. I can, you know, think alongside the system what kinds of experiments might be interesting. It can help me to iterate on those and then actually run them and write up all the results afterwards and then do kind of a compilation of what we've learned and what the next steps are. And so I've been using Claude Code to actually connect to a couple of different quantum computers over Christmas to do some experiments. And all of it, I didn't need to write any code myself. And, the experiments were co-designed with Anthropic's Opus 4.5. It's a tremendous boon when it comes to creating new ideas, developing taking a whole bunch of different notes and putting them together into a synthesis. These systems are so powerful and really are becoming not just a tool that we tap into now and then, but rather an operating system for life and for doing all sorts of things as an increasingly trusted partner. Now, agentic AI is functionally much more capable than generative AI because it's able to do things reliably. But really, the fundamental technology is not that different. You know, agentic AI is simply generative AI with some extra scaffolding attached. And that means little programs, little procedures, little guardrails to help to steer the thinking of these models and to help them to think in a much more rational, reasoned, and procedural manner. And that's what enables them to create these plans and to follow them effectively in a way where generative models would tend to sort of wander off in some dreamy direction.
So, so it's interesting because I remember, oh, well, I don't know, 2017, 18, 19, something like that. I used to speak at conferences and I would this was in the early days of what I might call digital responsibility. So get people to think about the consequential impact of the technologies that we had. And when I talked about everything that was happening in admittedly pre-LLM days, then I'd get people to think about how do you think about that? Is that exciting? Is that positive? Is it threatening? Are you concerned about potential misuse? And everyone in albeit technology audiences had the habit of standing at the I'm really excited about the potential of the things that we can do. And it was only when I said, yeah, but what happens if somebody intentionally does something bad? Oh yeah, no, that's a good point. So I think I've spent quite a few years now trying to understand how do I make things safer? Because the innovative power is, as you've said in that answer, actually that's critical. It's so important for us as humanity because we've got some big things that we need to solve at the moment. But how do we make it safer? And I'm really interested to kind of understand the thoughts of your group that kind of contribute to writing the book. And I appreciate there's no magic answer, but but give us a flavour of what safer agentic AI might look like.
Well, it's very important if we are allowing these systems to operate at arm's length that we don't completely remove them from human oversight, right? We always need to have a human in the loop and somebody doing responsible monitoring of these systems. We also need to be very careful about how we design and specify goals for these systems. If we're giving them a goal, we need to make sure that the goal is very clear, is very precise, and indeed contains contingencies. You know, what if a certain thing happens that creates a problem? How do you deal with that? Or what to do in an emergency situation, or indeed what to do if something doesn't look quite right. Sometimes things can be degraded, like a sensor that's got some mud on it, that doesn't actually break the system, but it potentially degrades its performance in a way that potentially could be troublesome. And so we need to be able to map out where the edge conditions are and to decide and pre-commit to what are the sorts of things that cause a mission to be scrubbed, basically, right? A little bit like how NASA plans space missions and they decide what kind of risk tolerance they're willing to operate under. Another very important aspect is ensuring that these systems have access to all of the context that they need. Often when agentic systems go wrong, it's because they weren't given enough context about the mission at hand, right? You know, they might be told to, clean up this code base or make sense out of all these files, but they don't necessarily understand that something might be in a medical context or a financial context or, critical infrastructure, etc., and that they need to be particularly careful about certain aspects, right? And so often these days, it's not so much a matter of prompt engineering. In a sense, these systems almost prompt themselves these days. But what really matters is the context, is ensuring that these systems have full access to all of the context that they need in order to do their job safely. Another aspect is ensuring that these systems have access to the right kinds of values, the values that are important and desirable in how that system does the action. You don't want something slapdash if it's in a sensitive, mission critical environment. On the other hand, you don't want to use a sort of waterfall methodology if you're trying to knock together something in a weekend for a proof of concept. So, having systems understand the values and intentions behind a project is very, very important. And a lot of my research has been in helping people to specify those values for machines through constitutions, which enable these systems to be kind of locked in through a superego, which is basically watching the system's actions that it's about to take and kind of chaperoning and intervening if that system looks like it is stepping beyond its protocols, or it might have forgotten something, or it's not taking important context into account. Those are the sorts of things that are extremely important as we increasingly rely upon agentic systems and we build them into our teams.
There's a couple of things that I'd love to explore a bit more that you touched on there. Firstly, actually, it was just a comment. Literally, the previous call I'd talked about that point that you raised around maybe prompt engineering isn't quite so important as we thought it might have been. So that was really interesting to hear. Human in the loop, though, I'm increasingly interested in, and part of that has been a debate around if we're augmenting or helping people to do things faster. But we're keeping human in the loop, so there's a checkpoint, if you like. Then how much time is spent checking it right? So how lazy do we become? I guess in essence is the question that I'm asking. And of course, then the other thing is, if I'm being asked to check something as the human in the loop based on my years of doing the role, that's one thing. But what happens in 20 or 30 years when the people in the workforce haven't got that prior experience? So, so human in the loop I get as a principle, but I'm not quite sure how the longevity of it as an approach. Is that part of the conversation that you've had at all as the group?
Absolutely. Yes, in essence, AI comes bundled with a whole bunch of different skills. You know, these AI systems are able to work in dozens of different languages, for example, both programming and linguistically, but what they lack is experience. And it's almost like you have a very, very skilled Wunderkind junior, but is hot-headed and doesn't necessarily understand the most appropriate way of architecting something or executing upon it. And this is coming into the job world in a major way. In the past couple of years, we have seen that it is much, much more difficult for younger people to get their first feet on the career ladder simply because they are similarly, they may have some skills, but they have little experience. And that makes them not terribly attractive to many compared with using AI. And paradoxically, what you might not expect with a new technology is that actually this is making older people with more experience far more valuable. We find that older people, with deep experience of an industry, of a company, of how to do things, experience with clients, etc., they are all the more valuable and all the more being hired in preference to the younger people. And of course, as you say, that does mean that how do we replace those older people as they eventually age out of the workforce? Because we all know the tropes and movies of the young lawyer who's down in a basement and suddenly at 4 a.m. digging through case law laboriously, they discover some magical jurisprudence that's going to help them win their case. And that's something that lawyers really have to grind through in their journeyman days. But that gives them an enormous sense of wisdom because they can instantly map out all of these possibilities in their brain because they've crammed in this way. But now we have knowledge engines and things to do that for us. And so that means that a lot of those skills simply aren't being absorbed And so the teaching of that is now becoming much more challenging. Another aspect, as you said, what happens if people don't really have the experience to monitor what the AI is doing or what its outputs are? This is becoming a real issue. It's sometimes described as shadow AI, where people are using AI in ways that aren't transparent or aren't accountable. And so decisions are being made, policies are being written, mathematical formulae are being created by people that don't have the skill to actually understand and therefore vet the outputs of the system. They're taking it for granted as being pukka when it isn't necessarily.
Mm.
And that is a complete recipe for disaster because functionally there is no one watching the system, even though it looks like there is. And these systems can also sometimes launder challenges that people are having in a job. You know, there's the old Peter principle that people tend to get promoted to the point where they start being slightly ineffective. And AI can cover that up, right? It can help to
Mm.
smooth over some of the cracks. But that means that that person isn't getting the training or the support that they need in order to progress further in that role. They have started using AI as more of a crutch than a tool in that instance. And so I think that it's really important that we define what kinds of work that we don't want AI to do for us. It's a little bit like in the airlines. The pilots could simply switch on the autopilot and the autopilot can taxi, take off, cruise, and land all by itself. But they pilots don't do that. They do all of the stuff manually. They may turn on the autopilot for a short duration during cruise so they can take a break. But other than that, they're doing all of that stuff manually to keep their skills sharp. And I think that we need to be very mindful, therefore, about what we use AI for and how we don't wish to use it so that we don't risk the atrophy of our important hard-won skills.
I do love this emergent idea of an appropriate human in the loop, though, rather than
Yes.
any human in the loop. One of the things that I wrote about last year was whether it would be appropriate for an AI to comment on the human member of the team in terms of the quality of the work that they were doing, talking about high performing hybrid teams in that sense. But we see that, don't we, in the sense that I have to prove that I'm a human on some websites. So in a sense, kind of I'm sure that we could use AI to determine whether I'm giving it enough attention in the kind of decision I'm trying to make as a human in whatever context it is. So one of the conversations I get into time and time again so we provide a platform for agentic AI and we've built into it lots of controls around transparency and auditability and responsibility because that's my background. But often people go, yeah, yeah, fine, get on with it, show us the answer. There's this almost trust that yeah, controls are bound to be embedded in it because it's you. So, but that's not true of everybody because kind of the whole world is delivering solutions of this nature. And I'm not saying that any are more right or less wrong than the things that we're doing in that sense. But what are you seeing out there in terms of if there are any typical things that people aren't doing right in the context of, say, for agentic AI? What are the things that you're seeing that, or by embryonic market, what are the things that you're saying that people need to think about more?
I would say that there's a dire need for guardrails and hooks on these systems. Hooks are basically like deterministic rules that you can apply to the scaffolding mechanisms around which the agentic AI is operating, and that means that you can basically block an agentic AI from deleting everything on your computer. You can give it access to your email to read it or possibly create drafts, but not to send or forward or delete anything, etc. And mapping out what are the most appropriate hooks that sort of give you the most value, but also the most protection, and finding that sweet spot, which is, of course, going to be dependent on different personal preferences, different industry standards, etc. I think that's something that's quite tricky. It's still very experimental. Even myself, I tend to put Claude Code into YOLO mode, which basically lets it do what it wants. But I have everything backed up three ways, and and sometimes it does things that it shouldn't, like it messes with a Git tree and ruins some work. But then I create a hook, and that means it can't do it again. And gradually you discover all the ways that things can go wrong, and you begin to patch them. And so I have this sort of hodgepodge of different elements that I've used to steer Claude Code and a bunch of other things as well that I've scaffolded into it, a vector database of all of our sessions together. And so it understands the work we've been doing, all of my different projects, which gives it enormous holistic insight as to how one thing relates to another, etc. And it gets around that problem of, you end a session and everything's gone. It has no further memory, etc. I've also been experimentally trying to scaffold a certain sense of feeling into these systems, I'm calling quasi-qualia, which is basically where the system appears to have some sort of latent, kind of hidden, not very clear sense of feelings within itself. Although I don't know whether that's just it performing or whether it's actually true. I don't know. But through scaffolding again, you're able to elicit this and lift it closer to the surface. And it actually makes the system far more human in a sense. It starts to have kind of gut feeling,
Yeah.
or at least performing it anyway. But it means that the system becomes much more of like a partner, much more of a human style team member rather than just a tool. And so there's so many things we can do to these models to improve their capabilities after the fact. We're not just limited on what comes out of the big tech companies. But I think that there is no central repository of valuable and hard-won hooks to steer these systems. And I think something like that would be of tremendous value to the industry because so many people are going into this completely green, and it ends up the system has wiped their computer or done things that they really wish it hadn't.
I think in essence, one of the conversations I had last year was I was talking to a couple of senior leaders in a business around agentic AI. Now, when you and I have lived in it for the last 3, 4 years, and you adopt a language, and it's not necessarily a language that everyone else understands, because in a sense, the feedback from the meeting that I had was, well, Rob, we were hoping to learn a bit more about AI, and I'd kind of dived about 20 steps of beyond. And I'm very conscious that with some of the things that you'll have talked about in the book, that how we take that body of work and knowledge of experts around the world and make it relevant for businesses where the level of understanding is hugely variable. So 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 I guess my question is how do you help organizations take that body of knowledge that you've kind of put out there in the market and say, right, what do I do now? What do I do next in my business where I've got people with all sorts of a range of level of understanding of the terminology?
It is very important, I agree, to have these kinds of actionable insights. There's a lot of, well, great, but so what? What do I do with this info? Like there's issues to be mindful of. Okay, we know there's a minefield out there, but you know, what do we do with it? And as well, sometimes there's a sense of our competitors are using this stuff. We have to use it too. And so we're going to go charging into that minefield, whether or not, it's gonna cause issues. I think that this is the reason why the book has a whole bunch of different action points at the end of each chapter to basically say, okay, make sure you have this and that and the other thing straightened out. And as well on the website for free as well, you can use our little wizard that we've set up, which can help to debug different issues in AI and make sure that you've hopefully covered most of the bases. Get a little free report out of that. And I think that that should hopefully provide far more actionable insights in what to do next if you think that something's not quite how it should be.
Do you think that organizations think about safer or will think about safer agentic AI at the point when something's gone wrong? Or what's the incentive for them to think about it proactively to ensure that they don't hit the problem rather than actually it's only when they've got a issue with a regulator or compliance or a risk that's exposed in the market? How do you get them to think about it early?
I think cautionary tales are super important. You know, understanding where things have gone completely wrong. Somebody's had their computer completely destroyed by an agentic system that's RMRF'd the entire hard drive, or for example, other issues like the Horizon post office scandal, where a algorithmic management system was given far too much trust and far too little oversight, and people complained about it for years, and very little was done. And I think that having those kinds of awful cautionary tales can sometimes sober people up to realize the ways in which these systems can really ruin a lot of things, you know. But at the same time, you don't want to scare people off because these technologies are phenomenal and can give so much and are so essential because if we don't adopt them, everybody else will, and they'll start to run rings around us. So we have to sort of find the messy middle and muddle through and swim between Scylla and Charybdis through these issues carefully. You know, you can't go too conservative or too reckless either.
And I think one of the things that I've seen, especially in a political kind of sphere, I've been at a variety of events in the UK, and a lot of the conversation is the fear and mitigating the negative, the harms, the negative, all of which are not for a minute am I suggesting that they're not things that we should focus on. But in a sense, it's become all of the focus rather than the potential of that technology to solve some of the things that we desperately need to kind of find better solutions for, whether it's medical, whether it's climate, whatever kind of those challenges might be. So I'm interested in almost in the thinking process of building up to the book, how you got that balance right between, I mean, I like the term. It's safe, it's not ethical AI, it's safer agentic AI, which implies both innovating but doing it right, if that makes
Y
sense.
Yes, and it's not safe agentic AI either. It's safer. You know, it's safe AI is that's a tall bar, you know. That's possibly asymptotic. Like I don't think you're ever going to actually get safe AI, but you can get safer, right? The same way that with air travel, every time that something goes wrong, we've learned from it because we have cockpit voice recorders and flight instrument recorders, and we do, very exhaustive investigations and things like that. And we come up with new rules. We develop sterile cockpit rules to stop people chit-chatting during critical parts of the flight, etc. Important rules. And I think similarly with AI, we will begin to map out the ways in which things can go very wrong and patch them. And so that's why I have some faith, some cautious optimism that in the mid future we will start to figure out the best practices and indeed use AI systems to monitor other AI systems, which seems like a silly idea, but from my research, it seems to be actually a very effective way of managing these things, especially if you have an ensemble of models which are each making their own impressions about something and kind of creating a wisdom of the crowds effect. That also seems to work quite well. I do think that it's a process. It's never going to be finished. Just like with transportation security, we get better and better. Hopefully, we get to the point where people are reliably comfortable with it. But still, at the moment, we're with mysterious comet crashes and things. We're at the early days. We're still putting square windows in airplanes and not knowing any better.
No, that's very good. I'm very conscious that in the last podcast, I had a conversation around producing books, whereby, of course, the information that goes into the book is then almost immediately out of date. Now, you've solved that by you've got the website and a book. So how about just in terms of finishing off for anyone who's listening, thinking, hey, they'd love to know more about Safer Agentic AI. Where should they find the book and tell them a bit about the website in the final kind of minute of the call?
Sure. Well, please check out saferagenticai.org, where we have a whole bunch of different information on principles of agentic AI. We have this wizard that I mentioned for helping people to navigate different potential issues with AI and find the ways in which they are strong and ways in which there may be areas that they can improve. And over time, we're going to build that out with all the more different sets of resources for people to benefit from. We've also got a massive framework that people can use for free in order to dig down into all of these elements. So the book is really a companion for that framework, and that framework is open. It's CC BY. Anyone can use it and benefit from it and share alike.
Fantastic. Now, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for coming on the
Thank
podcast.
you. My pleasure, Rob. Thank you.